I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Allegra Goodman, the author of Sam, The Chalk Artist, many more, some great short stories, but today I get to talk about one of my favorite things, which is historical fiction and her new novel, Isola. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
So I was hoping that you would start by setting the story up for us a little bit, because this is really something special because it comes from a real story. This was Marguerite was a real woman. There was so many incredible things that happened in her life, and this story is just special. So I was hoping you could set up this book for us.
Yeah, sure. So Marguerite was a French noblewoman. And they know that she was a real person. She existed. And they know that historians know that she sailed to New France, as they called it, in 1542 in a ship that was supposed to colonize and spread Catholicism throughout the land. And this was many years before even the Pilgrims. So, really early. This was at the time of Jacques Cartier's third voyage to what we now, of course, call Canada. And they know that she was marooned on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But historians don't know exactly why she was marooned or what happened to her after that. And, while there are two contemporary accounts of what happened, one by the Queen of Navarre and one by a priest who claimed that he interviewed her later, those accounts conflict with each other, and they're quite short. They're about a page and a half each, maybe a couple pages. So when I first stumbled upon this story, I thought, wow, there's a lot of room here to write a novel. And I've always been obsessed with stories of castaways and shipwrecks. And, I've probably read Robinson Crusoe, 5 times, including like twice aloud to 2 of my kids. And I thought this is almost like a female Robinson Crusoe story, except that, a big difference that she's a woman, and a big difference that the climate is subarctic where she ends up. Robinson Crusoe was on almost a tropical island. His big problem was getting burnt by the sun, and he famously created a parasol to, save himself from that. That is not Marguerite's problem on this island. So I was just sort of thinking, how did she manage in the winter? What did she eat? How did she live? And so that was sort of all where I had space to roam and to explore.
I think that as soon as I saw the description for this book and started to think some of those same things as well before I got into really undergoing her adventure with her, I was thinking the same things of, this is completely different from so many castaway stories that we're familiar with. I was so intrigued just to know how all the pieces came together. Especially because, like you said, this is a real story. And one of my favorite things are those little gems that you find tucked away inside of something else. This account of a real person, and we get just this little tiny thing, and there's a whole life there, and there's a whole story to be told, but yet we only have this little bit, and what a playground we have to get to flesh those things out.
Exactly.
And this came to you at a time when you were, we will say, busy with other things. You had a lot of other work that you were doing at the same time, and yet this story, it seems like it really stuck to you.
It did stick to me. I stumbled upon the story of Marguerite many years ago, 22 years ago now, in fact. It was about, almost 20 years ago when I started working on it, in fact. So it had been in the back of my mind, and I thought, oh, this is so interesting. This would be so much fun to write, but it sounds so hard. And I'm stressed by the idea of doing the amount of research that I would have to do just to figure out what she would wear or how they would navigate in the ship. So I always had it in the back of my mind. And I ended up writing several other books during that period of time. And most recently, Sam, which was a contemporary novel about a young girl growing up on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It was a boulderer. And I was writing that book and well into that book and loving that story, which is almost like a stream of consciousness. It's very much, she's in the moment. It's a very contemporary story. And that was when, strangely enough, I started thinking about writing this historical novel at that moment. And I think in some ways, looking back, it was the physicality of Sam, that she is a rock climber. She is a boulderer, for all of that, what that means. She competes in a gym at times, but she also is one of those people who goes out in the woods and tries to find her way up a rock, or, strategically figuring out where her foot should go, where her hand should go, and figure out a summit of a rock. And it was as I was thinking, I think in those passages, that I turned back to this other story of survival, real survival, sort of life and death survival of a young woman who lived hundreds of years before Sam. And I just thought, well, maybe I should give it a try, and I ended up feeling I was quite daunted. I had actually surreptitiously been doing some reading of the period. Although I'd say that I was stressed by the idea of doing research, deep down, I love research. So I've always been a history buff. So I was reading anyway, but I thought, I can't do this unless I can hear the voice of this book. The book Sam has a very distinctive voice where it's in the present tense and it's very much in her consciousness. And the novel kind of develops as she grows. So the voice kind of evolves. And I thought, what is the voice of this book of a woman who lived so incredibly long ago? And I put away my computer and I took out a notebook and I just started writing what I thought might be the first sentence of this novel. And I kept writing sort of iteration after iteration of the sentence, filling pages of this notebook until around the 30th or 35th try, I ended up with this sentence that went something like, I never knew my mother. She died the night that I was born, and so we pass each other in the dark. As I wrote that, I just heard her speaking to me, and I thought, that is the voice of this book. And strangely enough, once I had that sentence, I felt like I could write all the many, many, many sentences that came after because her voice was inside of me. So I started writing that book while I was writing Sam. I would work on Sam in the morning, and then I would sort of time travel in the afternoon and write this book.
I have to say that is one of the most intense novel writing experiences I have heard. You decided not only to write one novel, which I think most people would consider a daunting task. You said, let me write two at the same time.
I should also say that Sam, I had a contract for Sam and I was writing Sam. My agent knew about it. My editor was working with me on it. And this book I kept secret. Partly because the response to Sam was so warm and people loved that character. And this book was so different. I was nervous about talking about it. And partly because I actually enjoyed the secrecy of it. There was something about writing about this woman on an island where she ends up alone, and then also writing alone and being with her in that space alone in my imagination that became very compelling. And so I didn't talk about this book for over 2 years.
So you were basically like Batman of novel writing, where you were one novelist by day and another by night.
Yes.
I love that. I love hearing you talk about Marguerite's voice because it is perhaps for me one of the most compelling things while reading it is being able to be with her so closely and so intimately, especially in a historical novel where I think sometimes we aren't as able to be close to the narrator because there are boundaries in our way of really understanding their life and what they are experiencing. And I think Marguerite's voice is so easy for us to step into.
Oh, thank you. I was very interested in that and in what happens to her as a person. And I think it's something that is relatable for a lot of us, being isolated, dealing with tremendous loss, and also coming to question her whole world, which she gets to do when she leaves everything that she knows and has to make her way in a new place.
I do think that there is an interesting connection between Marguerite and Sam. And as I came to finish Marguerite's story and just being struck by sort of this resilience that even though they are experiencing two entirely different things, that there is, and I think for women in general, this idea of resilience and this idea of never being able to, of never wanting to stop, of being able to just continue. And I think as I was reading this book, there are, not to spoil because there are just so many moments that are incredible, but she encounters just, challenge after challenge and just keeps going.
She definitely has her moments of doubt and her moments where she doesn't want to keep going, but she overcomes it. And that struggle was really, really interesting to me. It's a book where the protagonist is tested, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and she has to kind of find a new way and in a way forge a new identity for herself. So she becomes a new person when she is alone. And the aloneness is interesting. The title Isola is Italian for island, and it comes from a Italian map that they refer to when they're sailing, when the commander and the captain are sailing the ship. But I was also really attracted to that title because it sounds like I and then sola, I alone. And I was really interested in somebody who's, her community, her family is stripped away from her. And then so what are you then left with, And she has to find that inner resource.
And I love that this book to me felt like a love story in so many ways. There's, of course, a traditional love story, but there's also a love story between Marguerite and her friends, between Marguerite and Damien, between Marguerite and herself. I think that there is just alongside of this current of isolation, there is also always love, and I really enjoyed getting to watch how those two things interplay.
Oh, thank you. Yes, with her love for her nurse Damien, and of course there's her lover, but there's also her friend Claire. That's very much a love story as well, a love and friendship kind of story. And she has to re-examine all those relationships and figure out what she was to those people, what she is to those people, and also to kind of deserve their love. She has to figure all of that out. That's part of her journey as well, even when she's alone.
Watching the like you said, the journey that Marguerite goes on, both physically and emotionally, there are moments, so many moments where I had to stop reading for a second and like close the book and be like, okay, and then continue, which I love. I love being able to feel like I'm putting something into a book and getting something back at the same time. I think that comes from voice and from that connection and the trust that you sense when you're reading and you're like, oh yeah, I know that even though this might be literally terrifying me right now, I'm going to come somewhere on the other end.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's what every writer dreams of for a reading experience. I felt that way. It was definitely a labor of love for me to write it and to revise it and to enter into that world. So thank you.
I'd love to step back a little bit and talk about research, because I am what I consider, and I have mentioned this many times, I'm what I consider a rabbit hole reader, where when I'm going through and I'm like, well, I have to Google that, and I go off and I need to like learn. And sometimes that can be a little overwhelming, but I think, especially in historical fiction, but in your work, this was not something I was very familiar with, this exact time period, especially in relation to Canada and the sort of colonization there. But I found myself just able to slip in very easily, which I think is a testament to the research. So I was hoping you could talk about your process.
Oh, thank you. Of course, of course. Well, I did a ton of reading, and I'm also a bit of a rabbit hole person. I get a little bit attached to buying used books, often stuff that's out of print. Something will lead to something else. I guess my research was twofold. First of all, I did as much research as I could on the facts as they were known of what happened to her. And since there aren't that many facts, I had quite a bit of freedom there. But I tried to use what I had. And then the other research that I really worked on was sort of more like material research, like how did it feel to live in this castle? What was it like to be on the ship? I remember not just reading, but trying to find sort of experiential ways to enter into this. So I remember I just went to Plymouth one day and just sort of like walked around the Mayflower, which was a later ship, of course, but just wanted to feel the scale of it, how small it was, how crowded it must have been with colonists. In England, I toured the Golden Hind, which was closer to this period, which was also this wooden sailing ship. So I tried to sort of get the texture of these things. When I talk about her having a ruby ring I tried to find everywhere I could, like examples of what ruby rings would have looked like in that period. And probably the most helpful to me was I looked at artwork from the period and paintings of women. I looked at clothing, pictures of clothing, paintings where they were, in court dress, for example. And I'm very interested in clothes and fashion. And of course, in a book like this, these things mean different things at different times. I watched videos on how to load an arquebus or a musket, the kind of muskets that they had in those days, which were very primitive and took a really long time to load and were quite dangerous. How people dipped their pen in the ink and how they would write or trim a quill. And so I looked at all of those things. And then I thought about what she might have read. And, so then I started reading Christine de Pizan, who's a book that they might have had. And I looked at the French, guidebook, How to Be a Good Princess by Anne of France. And I looked at that in French and I looked at that in English. And I ended up translating the little pieces that I used to start each section. And I was actually pretty obsessed with this guidebook and decided very early on that the opening of each section would have a passage from that guidebook. And it would be all about what you should do to be a proper lady. And then, of course, she would have to do exactly the opposite in each of the sections in order to survive. So all of that sort of fed into my research. But probably the most important thing was sort of the research I did in my imagination about sort of what she might feel, how she might think. And I would liken that to almost performing in a play where you are developing a character and you might have all kinds of details that don't actually appear, but that are in your head that inform the way you perform and project this person, how you create this character for the audience. And of course, my audience isn't an immediate audience, it's a delayed audience, but eventually I get to people like you. So that's the reward.
Yes. I really love the attention to the very tactile pieces in this. Like you said, the trimming of a quill or the art that they encounter, whether it's through the books they're reading or the instruments they're playing. Mm-hmm. I was definitely doing some virginal Googling as I was going through because I was like, this is something that, for me, that's what would interest me. And being able to pick out those pieces of what would really connect with each person. There's a wealth of details in there.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I did listen to music. I should have added that. I listened to sort of music of the period and tried to think when her guardian is playing in one style and her lover plays in a different style, like how that would have all played out, what those instruments would have looked like.
I felt like I was there in so many moments, especially alongside of her emotions. Like just you even mentioning her guardian right now makes me a little angry and a little upset.
Yeah.
There's a testament to characters who come up and you're like, let me never meet this fictional man.
Oh, yeah, he's scary. He's scary. He's quite scary.
It really does also connect to this idea that the idea of womanhood was so different at this time. It goes along with the Anne of France headers as well. This idea that she must really combat against because it's so ingrained in her, even when she is faced with survival. The idea of being who she should be, or for Damien, the idea of who she should be is so prevalent in their thinking.
Yes, I'm glad you touched on that. I think I like historical novels where people on the inside feel of the period and not like us. Sometimes they're wearing the right clothes and they're riding the right horses and the material details ring true, but then they seem like 21st century, proto-feminist heroines. And I totally understand that temptation, but this is a person who has been trained in a certain way. She is from a certain class. She is in a very religious framework coming from France. And that doesn't disappear even when you're alone on an island. It may be tested. It may evolve in some ways, but she still has that worldview. And I didn't want to throw that out. So that was precious to me as well. I thought a lot about theology. I thought a lot about, and she thinks about God a lot, This is somebody who lived before the Enlightenment. She's not a secular person, though, in the way that many of us take for granted in our lives. So And I really enjoyed that challenge. I enjoyed working with that.
I agree. It made it feel, in some ways, it was difficult to read because, you have those moments where you go, oh, if you could just make this different choice or see this different way. But we also know, well, she's lived her entire life in this one way. She's living in a world that views things one way. And there are moments, even, again, this is me talking around some things, but it almost is a huge, it almost shatters the whole thing. There are points where she really is almost unable to keep surviving because of the ways that she is taught and the things that she thinks.
Yes. Yeah. I was really interested in that. That's what makes it fun as a writer to work with people like that. But you know what also is fascinating, sort of like Sam, her heart opens and she learns so much on this journey, even within the confines of what she knows and what she's done. This is a young woman who's probably never even dressed herself before she is marooned. She says at one point, she's never even touched a broom, let alone gone hunting for food to eat. So tremendous movement, progress, change is happening to her.
Especially because I think in the narrative of survival stories of man versus wilderness, it's even there. It's man versus wilderness. Yes. I think very rarely do we encounter a woman versus nature story. I was thinking a lot of the Vaster Wilds while I was reading this, just that idea of this is a woman versus nature and that how that story is different inherently.
Yes. And I think in this, when it's a woman against nature, when it's a woman in that of this time, out on her own, one of the things she realizes is that she's not safe where she is. But at one point she thinks, I wasn't safe where I was either. And that's not something a gentleman might have thought. If she'd been a young nobleman, she would have been fine. If she could just get off that island and get back to France and to her lands and her servants and the life that she'd had, she would have her power back, or he would have his power back. But she doesn't have that option. She's not home free if she gets home. And that really fascinated me.
I do think it is this interesting dichotomy of, well, what are you hoping to be rescued to when you really have to have that moment to understand? And I think that realization comes slowly, but there is that thing of, well, it's not, she can't stay, but where does she go?
Exactly. So that's a big difference between a book like this and Robinson Crusoe. It was also really important to me I could have just written this book, like the book could have started when she's being marooned on the island. She's in the boat going to the island. That's page 1, and that might have been a dramatic way to start. But I wanted, to me, all of the material on the island makes sense, makes a lot more sense if you know where she's come from. So I wanted to establish the whole world that she came from. And then not to give too much away, but, I don't end with the end of the time on the island. For the same reason, I want to show what happened to her, how she grew, the consequences of all of that.
Yes. I think if we're just going for an adventure story, of course, there is that in there as well, but it becomes so much more rewarding when you really know the characters. And I think in historical fiction, at least for myself, when I read so often, the plots are these wonderful worlds that are created, but what really sells it is the character and being able to be close to them and know them. I think about Hilary Mantel and her writing, and that, yes, there are these wonderful, she's created this wonderful world for us, but there's also these characters that we know so well.
I love Hilary Mantel. She's probably she's certainly one of my favorites. And you're right. You just feel so close to Thomas Cromwell. It's if you can start identifying with that main character, then the time traveling that you do is much more meaningful because you are with that person as they go. You are immersed in this world, and you fall in love when they do. You hurt when they hurt. You triumph when they triumph. And as a reader, that's what I love. That's what I want, and I want to give that to my readers.
I think historical fiction also offers us something that contemporary fiction isn't always able to in the same way of putting this lens on things that are still very important and still very prevalent in contemporary times. Many of the struggles that Marguerite has, they're not that different from things we're still facing, but allowing that little bit of distance and that different perspective can sometimes let us really look at things in a different way.
Totally. I felt that, especially with her so-called guardian, who is her kinsman, who is the one who commands the ship and the one who maroons her. It's almost like if a lot of his behavior did not seem obsolete to me, let's just say. And the way he treats her as a young woman, he goes through all the things that we would call sexist today. He belittles her. He discounts what she says. He exerts control over her body and mind. We have the benefit of more of a rule of law, thank goodness. But, and he abuses her in some ways, in subtle ways, psychologically more than anything else. And all of that seems very real to me still.
I think, too, along this line of the same feelings that Marguerite feels, this idea that people may not ever know who she is, that her story may be lost.
Yes.
And I think that is something that people in this contemporary time still experience, is like, who will tell our stories, and will our stories be able to be told?
Totally. And, it's interesting, even the way I stumbled upon her story was in a book that I read I wrote about this in the author's note. I was on a trip to Canada with my husband and 4 young children, the youngest of whom was a newborn. And I had taken out a stack of books from the library which are for kids and young adult books about the Canadian history, which I thought sort of optimistically I would share with my boys. And of course, they weren't interested in reading any of them, but I was up all night with the baby and I read a whole stack. And in the book that I found, and I can actually send you a picture of the page because I went back to the library and I found that book again. But it's basically a book about Jacques Cartier's 3 voyages to Canada, to the New World. And literally in parentheses, it says, on the 3rd voyage, a ship of colonists, a young noblewoman, not Marguerite, and sort of about a long parenthetical statement, close parentheses. And then he just goes back to talking about Cartier. So her story, which to me was the most interesting thing and was like a whole world in itself. It's sort of like, wait, what? Then what? And that was the parenthetical comment. It was like she was cloistered in these parentheses, within this history of this male explorer, who obviously was very important. But I think so often that's what happens with women's history.
I think that now we're finally at this point where historical fiction can offer us these stories. We can tell the stories of people who before this were sort of doomed to be a parenthetical or doomed to never been discussed at all. And now we have sort of this opportunity to go back and say, no, there was a whole life here.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's very exciting. And I think that's why we love historical fiction. And I think that's why I understand your hesitancy when you're writing Sam and you're getting this great response to be like, what if I write something completely different? But I think there's something so special about historical fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about as well sort of your literary influences, both for this book and in general, just some things you love that make you a reader and writer.
Well, you mentioned Hilary Mantel, and she's definitely somebody I admire tremendously in terms of in the historical fiction space, I guess. And other writers that I love, I got my start writing short stories. So I started, when I was very young, really admiring the work of people like Eudora Welty. And what I realize now, what I loved most about her stories, she was a master of voice, and her dialogue was so good. I carry that with me. Who else? In college, and when I got to be older, I was really obsessed with 19th century novels. I was obsessed with people like George Eliot and Charles Dickens and Anthony Trollope and, of course, Jane Austen. Those novels which are not just about one person, but about a person in a whole society. And I love the scope of them. And again, the voices and the details, the way they made everything come alive. And Tolstoy's probably my favorite sort of that group. I really love his interiority and the way he gets inside people. And almost it's sort of like shocking sometimes how acute he is in his insights into people's selfishness and self-delusions. So all of those things. And then I do love adventure stories. I've always loved Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, Robert Louis Stevenson's books, Kidnapped, for example. And looking back, I see that fed into my attraction to this story of a woman on an island. I should also mention I grew up on an island, which was a larger island, Oahu, and a tropical island. So I've always been attracted to stories of islands. And strangely, because I grew up on a tropical island, stories of sort of northern exposure and struggles in the Arctic. Stories of people like Shackleton, you know.
Yes, I really connected to the winter. I'm from Minnesota, and so I know what it's like to be lost in the snow.
You know.
Yes, I love hearing that you love short stories and that you write short stories, because I am a short story fan, and I think they just like don't get enough love in our world. I always want to be like, if you have time to like doom scroll for a little bit, try a short story.
Totally.
I think that it's such and especially when you have things like adventure stories or these really high intensity, I'm like, there's nothing like getting just like a high impact short story to draw you in.
I totally agree. And I think, I still write short stories even now. Yes, absolutely.
Do you have readers that you hope find this book? Like if you imagine someone walking into a bookstore and seeing Isola on a table?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I hope that readers of historical fiction will enjoy this because they already like time traveling and they already like going into different worlds. But I guess I also hope that people who might not read a lot of historical fiction might get into this novel and enjoy the adventure of it, enjoy the self-discovery in the book. So, you know, I look beyond lovers of historical fiction as well. And sort of anybody who wants a good yarn, I would say. I put this out there and, you know, hope they love it.
Yes. Is your next goal to try and write 3 novels at the same time?
You know, it's funny. You mentioned the short stories. After this book, I had already written, and I'd been working on it over time for many years, but I have a book, it's a book about a contemporary Jewish American family. And parts of it have been published as stories in the New Yorker and a few other places. And that book is it's done. So it's scheduled to come out after this one. So I guess you could say I was also writing the short stories while I was doing these 2 things, but it was, but as stories, not as a novel, you know?
I think you should just change your byline to Allegra Goodman, overachiever.
Oh, and I will say, I really was only able to work on more than one thing at once when my last child went to college. So it's just been a few years. I've had kind of an explosion of work. I've just been writing a lot. And it's partly because I was ready to tell some of these stories, but it's also partly in practical terms. And if anyone's listening who has kids, you know, I have a lot more time. And my oldest son, who was, of course, on that trip to Canada and was not interested at the time, he in the history of Canada for young people, he became a labor economist. And he actually said to me, I've noticed that your productivity has gone way up since we left home, you know, which is a true statement. So I've had a bit more time.
That's a very generous answer.
I'll say one other thing that I actually write very slowly, and it doesn't sound like I do, but I write really slowly. And so I only have in me like a couple hours a day on a project like this, where after that, my brain starts to explode. And the big insight that I had into myself was that although I couldn't work all day on a novel like this, I could do something different. I could work on a different project. So switching it up was helpful for me. And so I could work very slowly on a couple things rather than be that kind of writer who goes away for 6 weeks and like pounds out a book. That is not me. I'm a gradualist.
I love that. I think that however it works, right? Like that's however the writing gets done, however the books get made, we will take it. And I can't wait for people to read this story, to meet Marguerite, to go on this adventure with her. I am very excited for everyone to get their hands on Isola. So thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're back, and we are going to recommend some wonderful books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Isola, which all three of us are so excited to get our hands on. I'm Mark at my store in Cincinnati, but I'm going to let two of my very favorite book buddies take things away. I've got Jamie in Kansas, and I've got Donald in Michigan. Jamie, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
All right. Thanks, Mark. All right. I'm going to jump kind of way into the backlist here to a book that came out actually the week I began working as a store manager at Barnes & Noble over 10 years ago. It was actually the very first book that I bought when I arrived at my new store, and I went and picked it up off the table and bought it that week, and it was brand new. And that is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. And I think it fits really nicely with Isola. This book has haunted me since I read it. It is a very atmospheric and harsh story that's set in 1828 in rural Iceland, right? So it doesn't get more remote. And it tells the story of Agnes Magnusdottir, a woman who is condemned to die for her role in the murder of two men who were found nearby, stabbed, and their bodies burned to cover up the crime. Agnes, together with a teenage servant girl and a man for these murders, and these are such brutal murders for this time and place that really nobody really knows how to handle it, right? So they're split up to await their execution, but because there's no suitable prison for a woman like Agnes in a place that has really no civic resources at all, she's just entrusted to the care of this farmer and his wife and daughter in a very remote part of Iceland for the short remainder of her life while she awaits execution. And so as, of course, the novel begins, the family are just terrified of this very strange and dangerous woman who is now living with them. But the literal kind of harsh reality is that they have to get on with the business of living. This is a dark and brutal place, and there is a never-ending amount of work to do on the farm. And so they put her to work. And as Agnes works alongside them every day, and they get to know her, it's slowly revealed, of course, that her side of the story and the authorities' tale are pretty different. And that, furthermore, as a single woman who was herself born to an unwed mother and who has very low social status, she doesn't really have any recourse in this very unforgiving system. And there's actually a side character who is named Toti, who is a sort of like a young reverend who is assigned to spiritually guide her as she awaits death. And Toti's remarkably open-minded and is able to help bring Agnes and the family together. She's obviously very guarded at the beginning of the book, and the slow reveal of her character and her involvement in the deaths is just really well executed. These are really deep characters, very movingly written, and I don't want to give away plot points because it's a complicated story and it's a well-told one. It's her debut novel, and at the time it was published, to great acclaim, in no small part due to her really careful depictions of Iceland, which is, of course, beautiful but harsh, and it acts as a sort of metaphor for Agnes herself. But Hannah Kent talked about going to Iceland as a foreign exchange student when she was in high school and visiting some of these places, and she was just fascinated by their remote beauty. And so the detail that she's able to provide on the landscape and the climate is just tremendous. And she really did her research on the period as well. So her depictions of, the life on the family farm, what it took from the chores to the harsh winter weather, all of that really create this sense of place and time. It stuck with me for a long time, this book, because of the characters, I think, and their honesty and their ability to kind of see past someone at their worst and still have compassion for them and understanding for them, even if they've done something wrong, and really for Agnes's ability to forgive herself for the things that she's done. It's a beautiful and lyrical and just multi-layered novel. It's perfect for reading when it's cold and snowy and dark right now. Again, that's Hannah Kent's Burial Rites. And now, Donald, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thanks, Jamie. I mean, I don't even know if I can top that. I mean, that was a awesome recommendation. Isola, was a great, great novel, and I think now I'm going to have to go and pick up your book. So you've sold it to me. Also want to say glad to finally be back doing the Poured Over for the new year. It's so exciting. My pick is a little bit more recent. It was one of our Discover picks from last year, and it is Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. There's something that connects, I think, all three of these books, and it's atmosphere and sense of place. And I think that is what I was going for when I was looking at what to pick. 9 times out of 10, every time I think about place and feeling and the sense of, understanding a different way of life. And I always go to the Shipping News by Annie Proulx, but I've talked about that many, many times. So I had to really, broaden out there, but there's so many books that I fought over. But Whalefall I picked up for one very special reason. And it is one that reads like poetry. It is very, very short. It doesn't necessarily have chapters, but there's like these small, short chunk sections that are just brittly written. Everything feels like you're on the edge of a cliff. You are feeling the sea air. You are breathing in the world that Elizabeth creates in her book. And it's just also just a very different book than I've ever read. It takes place in 1938, and it's on a small remote island in Wales where a dead whale washes up on shore. So already you have that visual image of this whale up on the shore, and then you come to meet all these great characters, especially the 2 ethnographers that come to the island to help identify and understand the culture of that land. And so in this short, less than 200-page book, it's not even 200 pages, guys. This is a breezy Sunday read, but you are going to be pulled into a world that is so unique, so different, and yet the experiences that people go through, what the main character goes through, you're going to feel very connected to her. I saw people I know in the characters that are written about in the story, whether it's, from my family history or just things that I know about my family. It's another one of those hit home as well. So again, the book I pick for Partner with Isola is Whalefall by Elizabeth O'Connor. Tiny, tiny little book. You have to pick it up. It's worth your time. You can read it in like 3 hours on a Sunday.
You won't put it down once you pick it up, too.
Absolutely will not.
Yes to both of those. Oh my gosh. I know I can count on the two of you for fantastic picks, so thank you very, very much. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. We've got a ton of fantastic interviews coming in 2025, so please stick around. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Jamie, where can we follow you?
I am at BN Plaza KC. Donald?
I am at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.